This episode of the TRM podcast is brought to you by TRM, trusted IT solutions for today's business challenges.
Good morning. My name is Norman Carr. I'm the president of TRM Technologies. We are the largest provider of cybersecurity services to the Canadian federal government. I'm pleased to have with me today Peter English, who heads up our threat and risk assessment practice.
Hello, my name is Peter English. Thank you for the introduction, Norman. Just a little bit about myself. I have been conducting threat and risk assessments and SNA and other security assessments, as well as privacy, business continuity planning, and disaster recovery services for the last 20 years. Most of my work has been with the federal government of Canada, although I also work with private sector, big banks, like the Big Five, telecoms, and provincial governments.
We're here today to talk about security assessments and authorizations. I'd like to start off by saying, Peter, what's caused the shift from the traditional TRA, threat and risk assessment, towards just providing the security assessment and authorization?
Sure. Good morning, Norm. One of the biggest reasons, I guess, the simplest way to put it is, of course, there was a Government of Canada policy shift. So clients are trying to adhere to government policy. But also there are definite advantages to the more detailed SNA process over the more targeted threat and risk assessment process.
So what are the benefits of the SNA over the threat and risk assessment?
There's a lot of different benefits. I think the largest benefit is when you do security assessment and authorization, you're setting out a list of requirements ahead of time. These are a set of requirements that you're then going to assess compliance against. And this is much more in line with other development processes where you set out your functional requirements as well. So they're trying to create a situation where both security and the business functions are more aligned, so that people don't have this innate differentiation in their mind that security is something very different. It's a set of requirements just like any of your other functional or business requirements.
Surely there has to be various instances where a department will still want to do a threat and risk assessment.
Yeah, there are a couple of different situations where you're going to do a TRA. One, for example, is that the methodology that the Government of Canada uses for SANA does not deal well with certain very high-level threat actors. So this usually occurs with more security-oriented organizations like national defense or foreign affairs. But in those situations, you need to look at doing a threat and risk assessment as an addition to your SNA process. The other situation where you may want to do it is if you don't want to do the full lengthy SNA process, you have a targeted question, a specific issue, you want to work out the risks associated with that. So you do a TRA on that targeted issue instead of pulling out the entire SNA process.
Are there any reasons why a department would not want to conduct an SANA?
The biggest reason is going to be overhead. Many smaller organizations, particularly agencies and crown corporations, don't have the number of personnel necessary to maintain the SNA process. You have to have dedicated personnel who understand the process and are going to be going through the entire compliance assessment. And this can have a lot of different cycles. And you can bring in the outside consultants to assist you in this process, but you still need some participation from your own IT stack and security groups. So because of that larger overhead, the small organizations sometimes feel that they have to stay with the targeted threat and risk assessments because you can contract the entire threat and risk assessment process out to an external resource, and it doesn't have a very big impact on your internal full-time employees' cycles.
So what are some of the major pitfalls for clients attempting to perform an SANA?
So this is probably the most critical topic for most clients, particularly when they're looking at bringing in an IT vendor to provide them with a technical solution, whether that solution is something that's going to be housed in-house or even more complicated if it's going to be a cloud solution, which is where everyone is going. The challenge is when you bring in an external non-government entity, not all of these companies have experience with SANA. Some of them don't even know what SANA is. So you have to be very careful about setting your requirements when you run out an RFP or you're putting a vendor on the spot to ask them for their experience in conducting SANA and similar types of assessments, whether they're from the US and they're familiar with the NIST process or the FedRAMP process, or if there's someone from Europe or another area where they're familiar with ISO processes, their experience is critical. The problem is if you have a vendor come in and they're not experienced, you're creating a lot of overhead where you're going to have to create documentation and evidence and even change their internal business processes. And a lot of vendors aren't willing to do that if they haven't already set up their organization this way. The second major problem with external vendors and just anyone actually doing SA&A is scope creep. It's very easy to find that your scope of your assessment begins to expand out of control. So you have to be careful that when you're trying to assess one system, you don't end up trying to assess the entire infrastructure. And the third and possibly one of the largest ones is the cloud, with the major shift towards the cloud throughout all industry and the government of Canada as well. You have to be very careful when you're doing SA&A on a cloud provider. There are government programs to assess the providers themselves for containing classified and protected information. The challenge is making sure that you get a vendor who already has gone through this process, and therefore you don't have to reassess that vendor if they've already been assessed by a Government of Canada lead agency.
One last question. I find that some of the practitioners, the client practitioners that is, are still asking for CNA, certification and accreditation. Explain the difference between the CNA and SA&A.
Sure. The simplest way of explaining it is they changed the name on the door. SA&A is the successor to CNA. So when they decided to revamp the CNA process, they made it more in line with international standards and called it SA&A. And the SA&A process actually incorporates a bunch of the features of the threat and risk assessment process. And so it's sort of a merging of CNA and TRA processes to create the new SA&A process.
Peter, thank you very much. I think that gives us enough to get started with, and appreciate your insight and your guidance, and look forward to working with you on the next few exciting assignments. Thanks.